Embarking on a luxury ship from Miami is supposed to be the relaxing start to a tropical vacation. Instead, for a very specific breed of tourist, it is an opportunity to declare psychological warfare on maritime law. We have compiled 12 of the most hilariously absurd, deeply embarrassing passenger disasters that prove money can buy a premium balcony suite, but it cannot buy self-awareness. 1. The MacArthur Causeway, connecting mainland Miami to the cruise terminals, is a notoriously unforgiving stretch of pavement, capable of turning mild-mannered tourists into absolute lunatics. A couple in their early 30s from Toronto, Kevin and Sarah, found themselves stuck in a gridlocked taxi for an hour, sweating through their expensive vacation outfits and watching their designated boarding window slowly vanish. When their driver finally dropped them off near Terminal C, they were in a full state of cardiovascular panic. They sprinted toward the waterfront dragging 3 heavy suitcases, just in time to see a massive white vessel with a flat stern slowly pulling away from the concrete dock, churning up dark water and blowing a deep, resonant horn. Kevin dropped his oversized leather duffel bag right there on the blistering pavement and proceeded to have a very public, highly theatrical meltdown. He fell to his knees in his designer linen shirt, dramatically screaming at the ocean like a man who had just watched his family get kidnapped by pirates. Sarah pulled out her phone, aggressively pacing in a tight circle, and immediately called their travel agent on speakerphone, shrieking over the port noise that the captain had maliciously left 10 minutes early just to spite them. A seasoned port worker wearing a high-visibility vest drove his golf cart over to the screaming couple, holding a clipboard and looking incredibly tired. He waited patiently for Kevin to stop swearing at the horizon, cleared his throat, and asked to see their digital boarding passes. Kevin angrily shoved his phone into the worker's face, demanding a private helicopter transfer to the Bahamas. The worker slowly pointed his pen at the ship currently sailing away, explaining that it was actually a specialized dredging vessel meant for clearing the industrial harbor channels, not a luxury resort. If you have never witnessed a grown adult throw a temper tantrum at a piece of heavy dredging equipment, it is truly a magnificent spectacle. He then politely asked them to physically turn around. Exactly 200 yards behind them, docked securely at Terminal D and perfectly on schedule, was their actual 4,000-passenger megaship. The couple had just spent 20 minutes crying and cursing out a heavy-duty garbage barge while their actual luxury vacation was patiently waiting for them right across the street. 2. There is a 60-year-old dentist from Munich named Klaus, who fundamentally misunderstood the assignment when he booked a solo cruise departing from Florida. Klaus had apparently consumed nothing but reruns of 1980s Miami Vice Cop television shows for 6 months prior to his vacation, and he assumed the entire city, including its departing cruise ships, operated under a strict undercover detective dress code. On the very first afternoon, while normal passengers were walking around the Lido deck in comfortable swimwear and flip-flops, Klaus confidently strolled out of the elevator wearing a pristine white linen suit with the jacket sleeves aggressively pushed up to his elbows. He was not wearing a shirt underneath. I want you to really visualize this level of unearned confidence. He completed the ensemble with heavily tinted aviator sunglasses, a fake gold chain resting on his chest hair, and a silver aluminum briefcase that was physically handcuffed to his left wrist. He proceeded to walk through the crowded buffet line, nodding solemnly at the families eating soft-serve ice cream, acting as if he was waiting to make a high-stakes deal near the carving station. When a polite bartender finally asked what was inside the heavily secured briefcase, Klaus didn't smile. He just slowly unlocked the combination, popped the latches, and revealed a perfectly organized row of German sunscreen, a paperback novel, and a single green apple. 3. A fundamental misunderstanding of basic geography is a surprisingly common condition at the guest services desk, especially right after departure. Exactly 25 minutes after the ship had sailed past the iconic South Beach skyline, a 40-year-old woman from Arizona named Diane marched up to the marble counter demanding an immediate cabin reassignment. She was clutching a glossy cruise line brochure in her left hand and looking utterly betrayed. Diane had booked a premium midship balcony on Deck 9, specifically paying a hefty upgrade fee for what the website described as an unobstructed ocean view. The bewildered crew member looked at her reservation, confirmed her cabin details, and politely asked what exactly was obstructing her view. Diane aggressively tapped her acrylic fingernail against a photo of a pristine, empty turquoise horizon in the brochure. She then complained, with a completely straight face, that her current view was defective because she could still clearly see the high-rise condo buildings and traffic lights of Miami Beach. The crew member stared at her for several agonizing seconds, trying to find a polite way to explain that a massive cruise ship physically has to drive through the water to get away from the land. Diane genuinely believed that stepping onto the ship automatically triggered some sort of magical geographic isolation, and she was furious that the state of Florida hadn't immediately vanished from her sight. 4. Booking the absolute most expensive grand suite on a luxury megaship usually guarantees a completely stress-free boarding process. But a wealthy couple from Palm Beach decided that standard luxury simply wasn't good enough for their specific auras. Julian and Beatrice were in their late 50s, dressed entirely in beige cashmere despite the 80-degree Florida heat, and they had a fundamental problem with the cruise line's interior design choices. They believed the nautical blues and polished mahogany woods were, in Beatrice's exact words, violently offensive to her chakras. So instead of just dealing with it for a week, they used the chaotic window of embarkation day in Miami to sneak their personal interior decorator onto the ship as a registered guest in a cheaper cabin. The moment they boarded, the three of them marched directly up to the suite and began a hostile takeover of the maritime architecture. The decorator, a frantic man named Pierre, carrying 2 massive duffel bags full of velvet drapery and power tools, immediately started dismantling the room. They weren't just rearranging the pillows, they were actively using an electric screwdriver to remove the heavy, bolted-down brass lamps from the nightstands. They unrolled a thick synthetic white fur rug over the fire-retardant carpet, and worst of all, Pierre used heavy-duty masking tape to cover the ceiling. Smoke detectors with sheer silk scarves because the blinking green lights ruined the room's ambient energy. This is precisely when the ship's automated safety grid alerted the bridge that multiple sensors in a VIP suite had suddenly gone dark. A heavy-duty response team consisting of the chief engineer, 2 security officers, and the hotel director arrived at the cabin expecting to fight an electrical fire. Instead, they found Beatrice burning sage in a seashell while Pierre was aggressively trying to unbolt the television from the wall to make room for a framed abstract painting he had smuggled aboard. Just imagine the absolute panic of a ship's engineer thinking there's a raging inferno, only to find a woman purifying the air with dried herbs. The hotel director calmly explained that dismantling a seaworthy vessel is a severe violation of maritime law, not to mention a massive fire hazard. Julian countered by threatening to buy the entire cruise line and fire everyone in the hallway. The standoff lasted 20 agonizing minutes, with the captain eventually calling down to inform the couple they were 5 minutes away from being escorted off the ship in handcuffs. But the situation completely shattered when the cabin steward nervously squeezed past the security team holding a clipboard. He looked at Beatrice, looked at Julian, and gently asked what they were doing in Suite 10420. Julian arrogantly pointed to his digital boarding pass on his phone to prove his ownership of the room. The hotel director leaned in, looked at the screen, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. Julian's pass clearly stated Suite 10240. They had marched onto the wrong side of the ship, found a door temporarily propped open by housekeeping, and spent the last hour illegally vandalizing a room that actually belonged to a retired couple from Ohio. The real occupants arrived just in time to watch Beatrice carefully unwrapping her silk scarves from the smoke detectors while apologizing to a very confused Midwestern grandfather holding a plate of buffet nachos. 5. Boarding a cruise out of Miami means interacting with the local culinary ecosystem, which a 70-year-old grandmother named Maria took as a deeply personal challenge. She was traveling with her extended family on a massive American cruise line and simply refused to accept that she would have to survive on international buffet food for 5 days. Her solution was to visit a famous Little Havana bakery 3 hours before embarkation and purchase 42 individual cardboard boxes of guava and cheese pastelitos. She arrived at the terminal pushing a metal luggage cart that looked less like vacation baggage and more like a catering delivery for a medium-sized wedding. The trouble began at the security checkpoint when the X-ray operator politely informed her that a 6-foot-tall unstable tower of bakery boxes could not physically fit through the scanning tunnel. Normal people would have checked the boxes with the porters or thrown some away. Maria, operating on pure Floridian stubbornness, simply opened the boxes and began rapidly distributing pastries to the entire security line to reduce her overall inventory. She stood at the metal detector like a culinary dictator, vehemently thrusting warm, flaky cheese pastries into the hands of bewildered tourists and heavily armed port officers. Within 15 minutes, she had successfully bribed the entire shift of terminal employees with enough baked goods to induce a collective sugar coma, safely marching her remaining 20 boxes onto the ship with a triumphant smile. 6. Embarking on a cruise out of Port Miami presents a very specific set of cultural challenges, the most pressing being the local dedication to coffee. Hector, a 45-year-old contractor from Hialeah, simply refused to accept that he would have to spend 7 days drinking what he confidently described to his wife as lightly colored ocean water. So, instead of packing sensible evening wear for his week-long Caribbean vacation, he packed a commercial-grade stainless steel Cuban espresso machine. We are not talking about a small, convenient travel maker. We are talking about a 35-pound chrome monolith with dual steam wands and a pressure gauge that looked like it was stolen from the cockpit of a vintage airplane. When Hector hoisted his luggage onto the security belt at Terminal G, the X-ray operator instantly stopped the machine and called over 3 supervisors. From the monitor's perspective, Hector had packed a complex explosive device wrapped in heavily starched guayabera shirts. Have you ever tried to reason with a heavily caffeinated Miami local who feels his morning routine is under attack? It is a masterclass in stubbornness. Hector stood there in his polarized sunglasses, calmly explaining to the bewildered port security team that the machine was technically a dietary necessity, pulling out a perfectly roasted bag of espresso beans to prove his innocence. The supervisors were torn between calling a bomb squad and admiring the sheer audacity of a man willing to sacrifice half his baggage weight limit for a decent cortadito. The escalation reached its peak when Hector actually offered to plug the heavy machinery into the metal detector's power outlet to brew a fresh sample for the guards, just to prove it was harmless. He aggressively argued that if people could bring breathing machines and medical equipment on board, his need for perfectly pressurized espresso was equally critical to his survival. Ultimately, the chief security officer had to read aloud Section 4 of the cruise line's prohibited items policy, specifically the part banning high-wattage heating elements and commercial kitchen appliances. Hector was forced to surrender his beloved machine to the port confiscation room, spending the next 7 days on the ship visibly twitching at the buffet while aggressively stirring 3 packets of raw sugar into his standard drip coffee. 7. The sail-away party is supposed to be a carefree celebration of the upcoming voyage, but for a 25-year-old tech developer from Austin named Marcus, it was a high-stakes logistical nightmare. Marcus had discovered a famous stone crab restaurant in South Beach earlier that morning, but completely lost track of time drinking mojitos by his hotel pool. Refusing to accept that he had missed his culinary window, he ordered a wildly expensive seafood platter on a delivery app while standing in the terminal security line. By the time he successfully boarded, navigated the crowded elevators, and reached the open-air promenade on Deck 5, the ship had just dropped its heavy mooring lines and the thrusters were churning the water. The app on his phone, however, showed his delivery driver's car aggressively speeding towards the drop-off zone. Marcus ran to the metal railing, leaning over the side of the 150,000-ton ship, frantically waving his neon green hat at a confused teenager in a sedan who was standing on the concrete pier holding a grease-stained brown paper bag. The distance between the deck and the pier was at least 40 feet, and the ship was actively moving into the channel. Instead of accepting his loss, Marcus stripped off his braided leather belt, tied it to a bright yellow pool towel, and attempted to create a makeshift maritime pulley system. He dangled this pathetic cloth rope over the side of the luxury vessel, loudly shouting instructions to the bewildered delivery driver about tying the crab claws to the metal buckle. This highly suspicious activity immediately caught the attention of a deck patrol officer, who sprinted over under the terrifying assumption that a passenger was actively trying to pull a stowaway up the hull. The officer grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, yanked him away from the railing, and hauled up the makeshift rope, fully prepared to document a major security breach. Instead, he pulled up nothing but a damp towel and an empty belt. The delivery driver on the concrete dock had sensibly decided he wasn't getting paid nearly enough to participate in a pirate-style seafood heist, and simply walked back to his car while happily eating the $120 crab dinner. 8. At exactly 4:15 p.m. on a humid Tuesday, two 24-year-old finance bros learned a very harsh lesson about maritime schedules. They had spent their embarkation afternoon day drinking at a famous club on South Beach, absolutely convinced that the ship's strict 3:30 p.m. boarding cutoff was merely a gentle suggestion for less important people. When their rideshare finally dropped them off at the empty terminal, the massive 4,000-passenger vessel was already untied and slowly drifting into the main channel of Biscayne Bay. Instead of accepting defeat, booking a hotel, and flying to the next port like rational humans, they ran to a nearby marina and threw $500 in cash at a local teenager renting out jet skis. Their master plan was to chase down a 150,000-ton floating resort in the open ocean, pull up alongside the hull, and somehow gracefully climb aboard a moving metal wall with two designer duffel bags. The teenager drove the jet ski, with the two passengers clinging to his back, violently bouncing over the ship's massive wake while frantically waving their waterproof boarding passes in the air. The pursuit ended abruptly 2 miles out when the United States Coast Guard intercepted them, deeply unimpressed by their nautical improvisation, and escorted them back to shore while the cruise ship blasted its horn and disappeared into the Atlantic. 9. Navigating the chaotic labyrinth of Port Miami baggage drop-off requires a certain level of blind trust in the maritime logistics system, a concept that a 62-year-old retired corporate auditor from Calgary named Brenda fundamentally rejected. Brenda had spent 3 days pre-cruising in South Beach reading incredibly paranoid internet forums, which convinced her that cruise ship porters were secretly operating an underground luggage smuggling ring. To combat this imaginary threat, she visited an overpriced electronics store in downtown Miami and purchased a military-grade, real-time GPS tracking beacon, which she meticulously sewed into the inner lining of her massive, metallic silver hard-shell suitcase. Her anxiety seemingly proved justified when, 6 hours after boarding the 5,000-passenger megaship, her suitcase had not arrived at her Deck 8 balcony cabin. Brenda immediately opened the tracking app on her phone. The blinking blue dot representing her expensive evening gowns was not stationary in the cargo hold. It was actively moving. It went to the Deck 4 casino, paused at the roulette table for 20 minutes, took the forward elevator to the Lido deck, and then spent a full hour in the adults-only solarium. Brenda was absolutely entirely convinced that a brazen, highly confident thief was openly parading her metallic suitcase around the ship's entertainment venues. Try to comprehend the pure, unadulterated level of righteous fury that overtakes a retired auditor who believes she is actively hunting a maritime criminal. She didn't call security. She went completely rogue. She spent the next 2 days stalking the blue dot across the vessel, physically sprinting up stairwells and hiding behind potted synthetic palm trees, trying to catch the perpetrator red-handed. She even recruited 2 incredibly bored elderly men from her trivia team to act as her tactical flanks. On the afternoon of day 3, the app showed the tracker stationary in the ship's main atrium, right near the specialty coffee bar. Brenda initiated a hostile pincer movement, marching up to the velvet rope, fully prepared to physically tackle whoever was holding her silver luggage. She burst through the crowd, pointed her phone like a weapon, and dramatically yelled for the thief to surrender. The twist here is that there was no metallic suitcase in the atrium, and there was no thief. The blinking blue dot was emitting directly from the breast pocket of the ship's wildly popular, highly energetic cruise director, who was currently taking photos with a family from Ohio. In her absolute frantic rush at the Miami terminal, Brenda hadn't sewn the tracker into her luggage at all. She had accidentally dropped the small black disc directly into the cruise director's open tote bag while violently shoving her way to the front of the VIP embarkation photo line. Her suitcase, completely unbothered and perfectly safe, had been sitting in the guest services confiscation room since day 1 because her heavy-duty travel iron had triggered the X-ray scanners. Brenda had spent half her luxury vacation conducting a covert espionage mission against a man whose only crime was hosting a very aggressive morning Zumba class. 10. If you want to understand the sheer financial optimism of a first-time cruiser, look no further than a 28-year-old roofer from Ohio named Derek. Derek had arrived in Florida a day early and spent his entire Friday night at a massive, neon-lit retro arcade and bar complex in the Wynwood Art District. He confidently exchanged $300 of his hard-earned cash for a heavy velvet pouch filled with proprietary brass arcade tokens, specifically because the bartender jokingly told him they were the new official currency of Miami. The following evening, exactly 15 minutes after the cruise ship reached international waters and opened its casino doors, Derek marched directly up to a high-limit progressive slot machine. He completely ignored the glowing digital card reader, pulled out his velvet pouch, and began violently aggressively shoving his heavy brass tokens into the tiny paper ticket slot. The expensive digital cabinet instantly jammed, flashed a catastrophic red error code, and began emitting a piercing, high-pitched mechanical alarm. When the incredibly stressed casino manager sprinted over, fully expecting to catch a sophisticated international hacking ring in action, he simply found Derek furiously tapping the glass screen with his knuckles, loudly demanding his 10 free spins. The manager used a master key to pop the front panel, used a pair of tweezers to extract a jammed coin, and stared quietly at the smiling, cartoonish face of an alligator wearing sunglasses stamped into the cheap metal. Derek leaned over the plush leather stool and, with absolute, unwavering sincerity, tried to argue that maritime gambling regulations legally required all floating vessels departing from South Florida to honor local amusement park currency at a 1-to-1 exchange rate. 11. The underground economy of South Beach is a fascinating ecosystem designed entirely to separate gullible tourists from their money, a trap that perfectly snared a 23-year-old crypto enthusiast from London named Kyle. Kyle was traveling solo on a premium cruise line and firmly believed that standard rules simply did not apply to men who wore designer sunglasses indoors. While buying an overpriced iced coffee near the port, he was approached by a smooth-talking street vendor who offered him a once-in-a-lifetime maritime investment. For the low price of $500 in cash, the vendor sold Kyle what he called a universal diamond master key. It was, in reality, a heavily scratched plastic hotel room card with a piece of shiny holographic foil taped to the front. The vendor promised this card would grant unlimited access to the ship's bridge, the captain's private dining room, and the restricted crew-only sauna. Tell me, how exactly does a grown man look at a piece of plastic that clearly says Motel 6 on the back and believe he has just purchased diplomatic immunity on the high seas? On the very first night, Kyle confidently marched up to the locked glass doors of the ship's most exclusive, reservation-only steakhouse. He bypassed the massive line of waiting guests, pulled out his fraudulent plastic rectangle, and aggressively slapped it against the restaurant's digital menu screen. When the screen just awkwardly flickered, Kyle didn't quietly retreat. He demanded to see the maitre d', loudly explaining that he was a highly classified VIP investor who possessed the universal diamond key. The maitre d', maintaining a level of stoic British professionalism that deserves a medal, slowly inspected the card. He didn't laugh. He just calmly informed Kyle that while the holographic sticker was indeed very shiny, the ship's culinary department unfortunately did not accept access credentials issued by a budget motel located next to the Miami airport. Kyle was completely outraged, not at the street vendor who scammed him, but at the cruise line, and actually marched down to guest services to file a formal compensation claim for his $500 alleyway purchase. 12. There is a very specific, deeply destructive type of paranoia that infects jealous spouses, and a 48-year-old dentist from Dallas named Greg allowed it to completely ruin his luxury Caribbean sailing before the massive ship even left Biscayne Bay. Greg's wife had previously lived in South Beach during her 20s, and her most prominent ex-boyfriend was a relatively famous, highly muscular local fitness model named Alejandro. As Greg was standing on his Deck 10 balcony sipping a welcome cocktail and watching the final pallets of luggage being loaded at Port Miami, he casually looked down at the concrete pier and his blood ran entirely cold. He saw the distinct profile of a deeply tanned, incredibly fit Hispanic man with perfect wind-swept hair being rolled up the steep crew ramp on a large industrial utility cart. Greg instantly concluded the absolute worst-case scenario. He believed that Alejandro had used his deep Miami nightlife connections to smuggle himself onto the cruise ship as a stowaway, specifically to ruin Greg's marriage and win back his wife on the high seas. Instead of rationally discussing this sighting, Greg immediately went into full tactical survival mode. He rushed inside, locked the heavy glass balcony door, pulled the thick blackout curtains entirely shut, and refused to let his bewildered wife leave the cabin for the mandatory safety muster drill. He confidently assumed the ex-boyfriend was actively crawling through the ship's ventilation shafts like an action movie villain. Greg spent the next 48 hours acting like a rogue spy in a terrible Cold War thriller. He completely abandoned his vacation itinerary to conduct counter-espionage. He set up primitive ankle-height tripwires across the cabin doorway, using mint-flavored dental floss from his toiletry bag. He sketched a terrible, highly inaccurate composite drawing of Alejandro on the back of a premium room service menu using a golf pencil, and began aggressively interrogating random, highly confused bartenders in the multi-story atrium about whether they had seen a man with suspiciously perfect abdominal muscles lurking near the lifeboats. The escalation reached a critical, highly public breaking point on the afternoon of day 3. Greg thought he saw Alejandro's shadow near the carving station and aggressively barricaded himself behind the soft-serve ice cream machines in the buffet, loudly demanding the captain initiate a ship-wide lockdown to apprehend the stowaway. The chief of security, exhausted and deeply concerned about Greg's rapidly deteriorating mental state, finally escorted him down to the windowless maritime security office on Deck 2 to de-escalate the situation. They pulled up the high-definition port security footage from embarkation day, hoping to definitively prove to Greg that no unauthorized humans had breached the hull during the loading process. They meticulously zoomed in on the exact timestamp and location Greg provided from his balcony observation. The twist here is not that Alejandro was innocent, it's that Alejandro wasn't even flesh and blood. The high-resolution camera clearly showed 2 tired, sweating deckhands pushing a metal utility cart carrying a life-size, heavy-duty corrugated cardboard cutout of a smiling, shirtless Alejandro, who happened to be the new brand ambassador for a locally distilled Miami coconut rum. The 2-dimensional cutout was simply being transported to the Lido Deck pool bar for a week-long promotional cocktail display. Greg had completely alienated his furious wife, missed 2 incredibly expensive premium shore excursions in the Bahamas, built ineffective booby traps out of standard dental hygiene products, and triggered a massive maritime security investigation, all because he was fiercely, violently intimidated by a piece of cheap advertising cardboard. I want a verdict in the comments. Which of these 12 passengers would you absolutely refuse to share a lifeboat with? Defend your choice aggressively. If watching other people's tropical vacations spontaneously combust brings you joy, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Do it, because laughing at the sheer audacity of tourists is vastly cheaper than actually booking a cruise.